Welcome back to another sleepless night, dear listener. Before we dive into tonight's tale, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It truly helps more than you know. Tonight's story comes from someone who learned that sometimes the news finds you before it happens. I never believed in fate until I saw my own obituary in the New York Times 3 days before I died. It started on a Tuesday morning in November. I was sitting in my cramped Brooklyn studio apartment, nursing my third cup of coffee and scrolling through the Times on my laptop like I did every morning. The ritual helped me feel connected to something bigger than my mundane life as a freelance graphic designer who barely made rent each month. I was clicking through the Metro section when I saw it. A small obituary tucked between a story about subway delays and a restaurant review. The headline made my blood freeze. Jordan Blake, 28, graphic designer, dies in Brooklyn apartment fire. Jordan Blake. My name, my age, my profession, my neighborhood. I stared at the screen, waiting for my brain to process what I was seeing. The obituary was brief but detailed enough to make my hands shake. It mentioned my graduation from Parsons, my work with local businesses, even my cat Moxie, who was currently purring on my windowsill. The death was listed as November 15th. 3 days from now. My first instinct was to call someone, but who would believe me? Instead, I screenshot the page and refreshed it immediately. The obituary was gone. The entire article had vanished, replaced by an ad for winter coats. I spent the next hour searching the Times website, using every keyword combination I could think of. Nothing. It was like the obituary had never existed, except for that screenshot burning a hole in my phone's photo gallery. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in my old building sounded like footsteps. Every car honking outside felt like a warning. I kept checking my space heater, my stove, anything that could potentially cause a fire. Everything seemed normal, but normal felt terrifying now. Wednesday morning, I was exhausted but determined to figure out what was happening. I called the New York Times directly, navigating through their phone tree until I reached someone in the obituaries department. "Hi, I'm calling about an obituary that ran yesterday about Jordan Blake." I tried to keep my voice steady. "I'm sorry, but I don't see anything in our system under that name," the woman replied. "Are you sure it was in the Times?" "I saw it. I have a screenshot. Sir, if you'd like to submit an obituary, I can transfer you to our—" I hung up. They thought I was trying to place my own obituary. The irony wasn't lost on me. Thursday was worse. I barely left my apartment, constantly checking news websites and social media for any mention of apartment fires in Brooklyn. Nothing. But around noon, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. Obituaries, anytimesarchive.com. The subject line read, "Regarding your inquiry." The message was brief. "Mr. Blake, we understand your concern about the preview you received. These glimpses sometimes occur when the timeline becomes unstable. We cannot prevent what has been written, but we wanted you to know that it serves a greater purpose. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten." I replied immediately, demanding answers, but the email bounced back as undeliverable. When I tried to search for nytimesarchive.com, no such domain existed. That evening, my landlord knocked on my door. He was an older Italian man named Tony who usually avoided tenant interactions unless rent was late. "Jordan, I got some guys coming tomorrow to check the wiring in the building," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "There's been some issues with the electrical system. They'll need access to your unit around 6 p.m., November 15th, 6 p.m., less than 24 hours from now." "What kind of issues?" I asked. But he was already walking away, mumbling something about city inspectors and insurance requirements. I spent Thursday night at a 24-hour diner in Queens, my laptop and a change of clothes stuffed into a backpack. If I wasn't in my apartment, I couldn't die in an apartment fire, right? The logic seemed sound, but I felt like I was going insane. Around 5 a.m. on Friday, exhaustion finally won. I dozed off in the diner booth, my head resting on my folded arms. I dreamed about newspapers with headlines I couldn't read, and a voice that sounded like my own reading words I'd never spoken. I woke up to my phone buzzing. It was 7:30 a.m., and I had 17 missed calls from my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, My hands. Shaking, I called her back. Jordan, thank God. Are you okay? Where are you? I'm at a diner. What happened? There was a fire in your building last night. Around 6 o'clock, just like Tony said, those electricians would be there. The whole third floor went up. Your apartment. She paused. They said someone died. They found a body. My vision blurred. A body? The fire department is still investigating, but Jordan, they think it was you. Your cat was found safe in the hallway, but there was someone in your apartment when it happened. I hung up and immediately called the New York Times. This time, when I asked about Jordan Blake's obituary, the woman confirmed it had just been uploaded to their website, pulled up the Times on my laptop with trembling fingers. There it was, exactly as I'd seen it 3 days ago, word for word, except now it was real, and according to everyone else, I was dead. But I was sitting in a Queens diner, very much alive, staring at my own death notice. I never found out who died in my apartment that night, or why the Times had somehow published my obituary before it happened. The police questioned me extensively when I came forward, but the body had been too badly burned for identification. They eventually closed the case, listing the victim as an unknown vagrant who had broken in. I moved to Canada 6 months later, changed my name, and started over. But every morning, I still check the obituaries. Not just in the Times, but in every major newspaper I can find online. I've learned that death casts shadows before it arrives, and sometimes those shadows fall on the wrong person. Sometimes I wonder if that glimpse into the future was meant as a warning or a promise. Either way, I'm still here, and somewhere in New York City, someone else's story ended so mine could continue. But late at night when I can't sleep, I still check tomorrow's news, just in case. My name is Sarah Chen, and I died on October 23rd, 2024. At least, that's what the New York Times told me when I opened my laptop that Tuesday morning. I'd been working the overnight shift at Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan, another grueling 12 hours as a trauma nurse. The emergency department had been unusually quiet, which should have felt like a blessing, but in my line of work, quiet nights often meant something terrible was building just beneath the surface. I got home to my Upper West Side studio around 7 a.m., exhausted but too wired to sleep immediately. My routine was always the same: shower, coffee, then catch up on the news before crashing for a few hours. The New York Times was my morning companion, a way to reconnect with the world outside. Hospital walls. I was scrolling through the Metro section when I saw it. A small obituary, tucked between an article about subway fare increases and a piece on Broadway ticket sales. The headline made my coffee cup slip from my hands, sending ceramic shards across my hardwood floor. Sarah Chen, 31, trauma nurse, dies after hospital incident. My hands trembled as I read my own death notice. It detailed my career at Mount Sinai, my graduation from Columbia Nursing School, even mentioned my volunteer work at the free clinic in Chinatown. The obituary stated that I had died from complications following a workplace accident on October 23rd, today. But I was sitting in my apartment, very much alive, reading about my own death. I refreshed the page immediately. The obituary vanished, replaced by an advertisement for flu vaccines. I searched every section of the Times website, used every keyword I could think of. Nothing. It was as if the article had never existed, except I'd read every word. The obituary had been specific about the circumstances, complications following a workplace accident during her overnight shift. It mentioned that I was survived by my parents in San Francisco and my sister Jessica in Boston. All true details, but how could they publish something that hadn't happened? I called the Times directly, my voice shaking as I explained to the obituary's editor that I'd seen my own death notice. "Ma'am, I don't see any record of an obituary for Sarah Chen in our system," she said kindly but firmly. "Are you feeling all right? Perhaps you should speak with someone." I hung up, frustrated and scared. Was I losing my mind? 36 hours without sleep could cause hallucinations. I knew that from my medical training. But this felt too real, too detailed to be a sleep-deprived delusion. I tried to nap but couldn't shake the image of those words. Workplace accident. What kind of accident could happen at the hospital? I'd been working there for 6 years, knew every safety protocol, every potential hazard. The ER was dangerous, sure, but I was careful. I was always careful. By 6 p.m., I was due back at Mount Sinai for another overnight shift. I considered calling in sick, but what would I say? That I'd seen my own obituary and was afraid to go to work. Dr. Martinez, our department head, would have me in psychiatric evaluation before I finished the sentence. Instead, I went to work, hyper-aware of every detail around me. The flickering fluorescent light in Bay 3 that maintenance kept promising to fix. The loose handrail on the stairwell to the basement. The old medication cart with the wobbly wheel that everyone complained about. The shift started normally. A few minor cases came through. A kitchen burn, a twisted ankle from someone jogging in Central Park, an elderly man with chest pains that turned out to be indigestion. Nothing that felt dangerous or life-threatening for the staff. Around 2 a.m., everything changed. The ambulance bay doors burst open and paramedics rushed in with a trauma case. A construction worker who'd fallen from scaffolding, multiple injuries, barely conscious. Dr. Martinez called for an all-hands trauma response. I was assigned to blood transfusion duty, preparing units while Dr. Martinez and the surgical team worked to stabilize the patient. The man was hemorrhaging badly, and we were burning through our blood supply faster than usual. "Chen, I need you to run down to the blood bank," Dr. Martinez called out. "We need 6 more units of O-negative stat." The blood bank was in the basement, accessible by elevator or the stairwell with the loose handrail. The elevator was notoriously slow, so I took the stairs, moving quickly but carefully in the dim lighting. That's when I heard it. A voice calling my name from below. "Sarah? Sarah Chen?" I stopped on the landing between the second and first floors, listening. The voice sounded familiar but distorted, like it was coming through water or static. "Down here, Sarah. We've been waiting for you." Every instinct told me to turn around, go back upstairs, take the elevator. But the patient was dying, and I was the only one who could get the blood he needed. I continued down the stairwell, my hand gripping the loose handrail more tightly than usual. The basement level was darker than normal. Half the lights were out, casting long shadows across the hallway that led to the blood bank. I pulled out my phone's flashlight and kept walking, my footsteps echoing strangely in the empty corridor. The blood bank door was standing open, which was unusual. The area was supposed to be secured at all times. I approached cautiously, my phone's light cutting through the darkness. Inside, I found something impossible. Dozens of blood bags arranged on the counter, each one labeled with my name and today's date. Not the patient's name. Mine. As if someone had been preparing for my arrival. "We told you that you'd come," the voice said behind me. I spun around to find myself facing 3 people I didn't recognize. 2 women and a man, all wearing hospital scrubs but with name badges I couldn't. Read in the dim light, their faces were pale, almost translucent in my phone's glow. "Who are you? What is this?" I demanded, backing toward the wall. "We're the ones who write the endings," the man said. "The ones who ensure the stories come true as written." "You saw the preview," one of the women added. "The timeline was showing you what needs to happen. Your death serves a greater purpose, Sarah. That patient upstairs, he lives because you don't." I looked at the blood bags again, all bearing my name. "This is insane. You can't just decide who lives and dies." "We don't decide," the other woman said. "We simply ensure that what's been written comes to pass. The Times doesn't just report the news, Sarah. Sometimes it creates it." I ran. Dropping my phone, I bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The room plunged into complete darkness, and I could hear the 3 figures moving around me, their footsteps unnaturally quiet. "The accident has already been written," the man's voice echoed from somewhere in the black. "You fall down the stairs. The loose handrail gives way. Internal bleeding, complications from the fall. Clean, simple, believable. But I wasn't ready to accept that ending. I felt around in the darkness until I found the emergency lighting panel near the door. When I hit the switch, red emergency lights flooded the room. The 3 figures were gone, but the blood bags remained. my name clearly visible on every label. I grabbed as many O-negative units as I could carry and ran back upstairs, taking the elevator this time despite the delay. When I reached the trauma bay, Dr. Martinez looked at me strangely. "Chen, where have you been?" "I sent Rodriguez to the blood bank 20 minutes ago." "Rodriguez?" I looked around confused. "You sent me?" "No, I sent Rodriguez. You've been standing right here the whole time, helping with compressions." I looked down at my hands. They were covered in blood from the patient, not from handling blood bags. I had no memory of staying in the trauma bay, but according to everyone else, I'd never left. The patient lived. We managed to stabilize him, and he was moved to surgery just as the sun was rising over Manhattan. I never found those blood bags with my name on them. When I returned to the blood bank later, everything was normal, properly organized and secured. But I kept the memory, and that night when I got home, I checked the New York Times obituaries one more time. There was no Sarah Chen listed, no workplace, accident, no death at Mount Sinai Hospital. Instead, I found something else. Marcus Rodriguez, 29, emergency medical technician, dies after fall in hospital stairwell. Rodriguez, the colleague who had supposedly gone to the blood bank in my place, quit Mount Sinai the next week. Some stories are too dangerous to be part of, even when they save lives. My name is Marcus Webb, and I'm a fact-checker for a small online news outlet in Portland, Oregon. It's meticulous work that most people find boring, but I've always found comfort in the certainty of facts, the reliability of truth. At least, I did until I encountered an article that changed every time I read it. It started on a rainy Thursday morning in late September. I was working from my cramped apartment near Powell's Books, coffee growing cold as I verified sources for our weekend edition. My editor, Janet, had sent me a piece to review, a local interest story about a new art installation downtown called Memory Palace. The article seemed straightforward enough. A reclusive artist named Elena Vasquez had created an interactive sculpture that supposedly helped visitors recover lost memories. The piece described the installation as a series of mirrored chambers, where people could walk through and experience forgotten moments from their past. I read through it once, taking notes on the details I needed to verify. The artist's background, the gallery location, quotes from visitors who claimed the installation had helped them remember childhood experiences they'd completely forgotten. Standard human interest stuff. But when I went back to check a specific quote, the words had changed. The first time I'd read it, a visitor named Tom Bradley was quoted as saying, "I remembered my grandmother's garden for the first time in 30 years. But now the quote read, "I remembered my sister's funeral, even though I was only 3 when she died." I stared at my screen, certain I was misremembering. Fact-checkers develop almost photographic memory for details. It's essential for the job. But maybe I'd been working too many late nights, drinking too much coffee, not getting enough sleep. Made a note of the discrepancy and continued reading. The article mentioned that Elena Vasquez had studied neuroscience at Portland State before becoming an artist. I opened a new tab to verify her educational background, but when I returned to the article, that detail had vanished entirely. Now it said she was entirely self-taught with no formal education in art or science. My heart started beating faster. I took a screenshot of the article and then refreshed the page. When it reloaded, the screenshot and the current version didn't match. In the screenshot, the installation was described as having 7 mirrored chambers. On the refreshed page, it was 12 chambers. I called Janet immediately. "Hey, about this Memory Palace article, did you send me the final version?" "Of course," she said. "Why?" "Some of the details seem inconsistent. Can you double-check the version you have against what's in the system?" I heard her typing. "Everything looks normal on my end, Marcus. Same version I sent you this morning. Is everything okay? You sound rattled." I hung up and stared at my screen. The article was still there, but now it included a section that definitely hadn't been there before. A sidebar about visitors who'd experienced recovered trauma at the installation. It described people remembering car accidents, childhood abuse, the death of loved ones, dark memories that contradicted the uplifting tone of the main article. I took another screenshot, then immediately took a third. All 3 versions were different. In the first screenshot, Elena Vasquez was 34 years old. In the second, she was 29. In the third, her age wasn't mentioned at all, but there was a new quote from her. "Memory is not a recording device. It's a living thing that changes each time we access it. My installation doesn't recover memories, it creates them." That quote sent a chill down my spine. I'd never seen it in any previous version of the article. I decided to visit the gallery, myself. If I could see the installation in person, interview Elena Vasquez directly, I could separate fact from whatever strange digital glitch was affecting the article. The address listed in the article led me to a narrow gallery space in the Pearl District. But when I arrived, the windows were papered over and a "for lease" sign hung in the door. I called the number on the sign. "That space has been empty for 6 months, the landlord told me. Haven't had any art installations there." I checked the article again on my phone. Now the address was completely different. A location in southeast Portland that turned out to be a pizza restaurant. The staff there had never heard of Elena Vasquez or any art installation. Back home, I opened the article on my laptop. The address had changed again, this time to a warehouse in North Portland. But more disturbing were the other changes. The article now included testimonials from people who claimed the installation had shown them memories of things that hadn't happened yet. Glimpse of their own deaths. Conversations with people they hadn't met. Events that were still years in the future. One new quote particularly disturbed me. I saw myself reading an article that changed every time I looked at it. I was sitting in a small apartment, becoming more and more frightened as the word shifted. I realized I was watching my own experience of discovering the Memory Palace. The visitor who'd given that quote was named Marcus Webb. My name. My experience. Described in an article that was describing itself changing as I read it. I tried to call Janet again, but her number went straight to voicemail. When I checked my email, there was no record of her sending me the article. In fact, there was no record of me working for the news outlet at all. My employment emails had vanished from my inbox. I searched online for Elena Vasquez, Memory Palace, anything related to the installation. Nothing. No artist by that name, no art installation, no gallery showing such a piece. It was as if the entire thing existed only in this one article that kept rewriting itself. But the article was still there on my screen, growing longer with each refresh. New sections appeared describing the psychological effects of unstable memory, the dangers of accessing experiences that might not be real. It included warnings about people who'd become lost in false memories, unable to distinguish between what they'd actually lived and what they'd remembered through the installation. One new section was titled, "The Observers," and described people who'd found the article online. People like me who'd become trapped in reading about their own experience of reading about it. It mentioned several names, all fact-checkers and journalists who'd supposedly tried to verify the story and instead became part of it. My name was among them. According to the article, I was the 7th person to discover the changing text. The others had all disappeared from their jobs, their apartments, their entire lives. The article suggested they'd become so focused on trying to pin down the truth that they'd lost track of their own reality. As I read this, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten or slept or left my apartment. How long had I been sitting here watching the article change? The rain outside seemed to have stopped and started again multiple times. Or maybe it was the same storm stretched. Cross days, I looked at my hands. They seemed somehow less solid than before, as if I was becoming as unstable as the text I was reading. The article now included a final section, Exit Protocol. It explained that readers who'd become trapped could escape by writing their own ending to the story, by deciding what was real and what was false. But it warned that this choice would determine not just their understanding of the article, but their entire relationship with memory and truth. I sat there for a long time, watching. The words shift and change, new sections appearing and disappearing like thoughts in an unstable mind. Then I made my choice. I deleted the article, not just the browser tab, but the file itself from whatever server was hosting it. I used every technical skill I'd developed as a fact-checker to trace its origins and eliminate every copy I could. Find out the article fought back, reappearing on different sites in different formats with different titles. But each time I hunted it down and deleted it again. Finally, silence. My screen showed a simple error message. File not found. I looked around my apartment. Everything seemed solid again, real again. I could remember eating breakfast that morning, sleeping the night before. The rain outside was just rain, following normal patterns. But sometimes late at night, I still search online for any trace of that article. Not because I want to find it, but because I need to make sure it stays gone. Memory is not a recording device. It's a living thing that changes each time we access it. I should know. I've been trying to forget those words ever since. My name is David Park, and I live in a small town called Millbrook in upstate New York, population 847. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the biggest news is usually about the high school football team or Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning tomatoes at the county fair. We don't get the New York Times delivered here. Hell, we barely get reliable internet. But on the morning of November 3rd, 2024, I found one on my doorstep anyway. I'd been up since 4 a.m., unable to sleep after another fight with my wife Sarah about money. We were 3 months behind on the mortgage. My construction job had dried up with the economy, and the stress was eating us alive. I'd taken to walking around our small house in the pre-dawn darkness, trying to figure out how we'd make it through another month. That's when I saw it through the front window, a newspaper lying on our porch mat, crisp and white against the weathered wooden boards. I opened the door cautiously. The closest neighbor was half a mile away, and our mailman, Jerry, had never delivered anything before 10 a.m. in the 15 years I'd known him. I picked up the paper. The New York Times, dated November 3rd, 2024. The front page headline made my blood run cold. Millbrook tragedy. Local man's financial desperation leads to family murder-suicide. Below the headline was a photograph of my house. My actual house, taken from the exact angle someone standing in our driveway would see it. The subheading read, David Park, 34, kills wife and daughter before taking own life as foreclosure looms. I dropped the newspaper, my hands shaking. Sarah and I didn't have a daughter. We'd been trying for kids for 3 years with no success. But there, in black and white, was a story about me murdering a family I didn't have. I picked up the paper, again scanning the article with growing horror. It described how I'd lost my construction job 6 months ago. True. How we'd fallen behind on mortgage payments, also true. How the bank had issued a foreclosure notice. That had happened just last week. But then the story veered into nightmare territory. According to the Times, I'd snapped under the financial pressure. The article quoted neighbors saying they'd heard arguing coming from our house, then gunshots around 2 a.m. It described how police had found Sarah's body in our bedroom and our 7-year-old daughter Emma in her room down the hall. The article said I'd used my hunting rifle, the same .30-06 that was currently locked in our gun safe upstairs. But Sarah was still asleep in our bed, and we had no daughter named Emma. I read the article 3 times, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The details were too specific to be coincidence. The reporter had interviewed our actual neighbors, Bill Morrison from across the road, the elderly Kowalski couple from down the street. They described the David Park they knew. Quiet, hardworking, but increasingly desperate as his financial situation deteriorated. He'd been different these past few months, Bill Morrison was quoted as saying. More withdrawn, angry. We never thought it would come to this. The article mentioned that I'd been seen at Henderson's hardware store the day before, asking about ammunition. I had been there yesterday, but I'd only bought paint rollers for a small job I'd picked up. Frank Henderson had never said anything to me about ammunition. I ran upstairs to check on Sarah. She was still sleeping peacefully, her dark hair spread across the pillow, breathing steady and deep. Alive, unharmed. I stood in the doorway watching, her chest rise and fall, trying to reconcile the woman in our bed with the victim described in the newspaper. Then I walked down the hall to the spare room we'd optimistically set up as a nursery 2 years ago. It was empty except for some storage, boxes and Sarah's old exercise equipment. No child's bed, no toys, no sign that anyone named Emma had ever lived there. But according to the New York Times, I'd murdered her there just hours ago. I went back downstairs and read the article again. This time, I noticed something I'd missed. Before, the byline. The reporter was listed as Jennifer Walsh, someone I'd never heard of. But at the bottom of the article was a small note. Additional reporting by David Park. I had apparently helped write the story of my own crimes. I called the New York Times directly, finding their number online and navigating through their phone system until I reached someone in the newsroom. "Hi, I'm calling about an article that ran today about a murder-suicide in Millbrook, New York," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hold on, let me check." I heard typing on the other end. "I'm not seeing anything about Millbrook in today's edition. What's the reporter's name?" "Jennifer Walsh." "We don't have a Jennifer Walsh on staff." "Sir, are you sure you're looking at today's Times?" I hung up and immediately went to the Times website on my phone. I searched every section, used every keyword I could think of. No article about Millbrook, no story about David Park, no Jennifer Walsh in the staff directory. But the physical newspaper was still there on my kitchen table, real as anything I'd ever touched. I decided to drive into town to see if anyone else had received the same newspaper. Main Street was quiet at 6 a.m., but I found Frank Henderson opening his hardware store early. "Frank, did you get the Times delivered this morning?" He looked at me strangely. "Dave, you know we don't get the Times here. Haven't for years. Why would I want to read about city problems when we got plenty of our own?" "Did I ask you about ammunition yesterday?" "Ammunition?" Frank frowned. "No, you bought paint rollers, remember, for that bathroom job over at the Miller place." I drove to Bill Morrison's house next. He was in his driveway loading tools into his truck. "Bill, have you talked to any reporters lately? Anyone asking about me and Sarah?" "Reporters?" He laughed. "Dave, what reporter's gonna come all the way out here? You feeling all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I spent the morning driving around Millbrook, talking to everyone mentioned in the article. None of them remembered speaking to any journalist. None of them had said the things attributed to them in the newspaper. As far as they knew, nothing unusual had happened in our quiet town. But the newspaper was still real. I could smell the ink, feel the texture of the paper, read every word clearly. It existed in a way that contradicted everything else I could verify. That afternoon, I did something that scared me more than anything else. I went to Henderson's Hardware and asked about ammunition. "Need some 30-06 rounds, Frank." He studied my face carefully. "You sure about that, Dave? You seem pretty rattled today. Just need to do some target practice." "Clear my head." Frank sold me a box of ammunition, but I could see the concern in his eyes. As I left his store, I realized I was following the script the newspaper had written. Every step I took seemed to be pulling me closer to the ending it had described. That night, I sat in my kitchen with the newspaper spread in front of me, the box of ammunition on the counter nearby. Sarah had gone to bed early, exhausted from her double shift at the diner. The house was quiet except for the old furnace cycling on and off. I kept reading the article, looking for some clue about how to escape what felt like an inevitable fate. But the more I read, the more the described emotions resonated with my actual feelings. The desperation, the anger, the sense that I was failing everyone who depended on me. The newspaper wasn't predicting the future, I realized. It was showing me a possibility, a path I could choose to walk down. The question was whether I was strong enough to choose a different ending. I took the ammunition outside and buried it in our backyard, then locked my hunting rifle in the gun safe and gave Sarah the key. The next morning, the newspaper was gone. No trace of it anywhere, as if it had never existed. But I kept the lesson it taught me. Sometimes the most important news is about the future you choose not to create. Sarah and I are seeing a counselor now, working through our financial problems. Together, we're going to make it through this rough patch, and every morning I check our front porch, grateful for the newspapers that don't appear there. My name is Alex Rivera, and I live alone in a cramped studio apartment in downtown Seattle. It's not much, maybe 400 square feet with a Murphy bed, a tiny kitchenette, and one large window that faces an alley between buildings. The rent is brutal, but it's mine, my sanctuary from the chaos of the city and the demands of my job as a night shift security guard at a tech company downtown. I've always been intensely private. Maybe it comes from growing up in foster care, never having a space that truly belonged to me until I aged out of the system at 18. My apartment is the first place I've ever felt safe, where I can exist without performance or pretense. It's cluttered with my collections, vintage cameras I restore as a hobby, science fiction paperbacks from the 70s and 80s, succulents that somehow thrive despite the limited light. Every morning when I get home from work, I have the same routine: coffee, shower. Then I read the Seattle Times while eating a bowl of cereal. It's a small ritual that helps me transition from the fluorescent-lit corporate world back to my private cocoon. On the morning of October 15th, that ritual became a nightmare. I was sitting at my small table by the window, spooning Cheerios while scanning the front page. The main headline was about local housing costs, something I'd been following closely since my own rent had jumped again. But it wasn't the headline that made me freeze mid-chew. It was the photograph. The front page featured a large color image that the caption identified as "Interior of typical Seattle studio apartment, showing effects of housing crisis on young renters." But I was looking at my apartment, my exact apartment, photographed from the angle of someone standing near my front door. Every detail was perfect. The Murphy bed folded up against the wall with my grandmother's quilt draped over it. The exact arrangement of my vintage cameras on the bookshelf. My collection of succulents lined up on the windowsill in their mismatched pots. Even the stack of library books on my coffee table was identical, down to the specific titles and their precise order. My hands started shaking so badly I dropped the spoon. The metallic clatter seemed impossibly loud in my small space. I looked around my apartment, then back at the newspaper. Everything matched exactly. The burnt orange throw pillow on my second-hand couch, positioned at the same angle. The vintage Star Trek poster on the wall, slightly crooked because I'd never bothered to straighten it. My coffee mug from this morning, still sitting on the counter with the same chip in the handle, but I had never given permission for anyone to photograph my apartment. I had never spoken to anyone from the Seattle Times. I lived alone, worked nights, and barely interacted with my neighbors. How could they have gotten inside my space? I read the accompanying article with growing dread. It described the living conditions of Alex R., 26, a security guard struggling to afford rising rents in downtown Seattle. The piece quoted me discussing my financial struggles, my isolation, my fears about being displaced by gentrification. "I spend most of my time in this one room," I was quoted as saying. "It's not much, but it's the only place I've ever felt truly safe. Losing it would be like losing myself." I had never said those words to any reporter, but they captured exactly how I felt. The article continued with details about my life that no journalist could have known. My history in foster care, my collection of vintage cameras, my habit of talking to my plants when I felt lonely. Personal truths I'd never shared with another human being. I called the Seattle Times immediately. "I'm calling about the front page article today about housing costs," I told the receptionist. "The photo used is of my apartment without my permission. Let me transfer you to our photo department." The photo editor, a woman named Karen, sounded confused when I explained the situation. "Sir, I'm looking at today's front page right now. The photo is a stock image we purchased from Getty Images. It shows a generic apartment interior, not anyone's specific home." "That's impossible. I'm looking at my apartment in your newspaper. Can you hold for a moment?" I heard typing, then she came back. "I've pulled up the original file we used. It's cataloged as generic studio apartment interior, model released. There's no address associated with it, no individual's permission required." I hung up and immediately went to the Seattle Times website on my laptop. The online version of the article used a completely different photo. A generic stock image of an empty apartment with beige walls and no personal belongings. Nothing like my space at all, but the physical newspaper still showed my apartment, in perfect detail. I took photos of the newspaper with my phone and compared them to my actual room. Every element matched exactly. including details I'd never paid much attention to. The way afternoon light fell across my wooden floor, the specific pattern of dust motes visible in the sunbeam, the exact position of shadows cast by my furniture. That evening, I called my upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Chen, the only person in the building I occasionally spoke to. "Has anyone been in the hallway today taking photos?" I asked. "Photos? No, dear. Why would anyone want pictures of this old building? Has anyone asked you about me? Any reporters or photographers?" "Of course not. You keep to yourself so much. I sometimes forget you even live there. Are you in some kind of trouble?" I wasn't in trouble, but I was beginning to feel like I was losing my mind. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with figuring out how the photograph had been taken. I examined every angle, every reflection, looking for clues about where the camera had been positioned. The photo seemed to have been shot from near my door, but the perspective was slightly elevated, as if the photographer had been floating a few feet off the ground. I checked my apartment for hidden cameras, for signs of forced entry, for any indication that someone had been inside. Nothing. My space was exactly as I'd left it, secure and undisturbed. But then I noticed something else. The newspaper photo showed details that weren't quite right for the current date. In the image, my calendar on the wall showed September, but it was now October. The book on my coffee table was one I'd returned to the library 2 weeks ago. The photograph seemed to show my apartment as it had existed in the past, not as it was when the newspaper was published. I started taking daily photos of my apartment from different angles, documenting every change I made to the space. I moved furniture, rearranged my camera collection, changed which plants were on the windowsill. I was creating a visual record to prove to myself that my space was evolving, that it wasn't frozen in the moment captured by that impossible photograph. Week later, I found another newspaper on my doorstep. Not the Seattle Times this time, but the New York Times. I never subscribed to any newspapers. They just appeared. The front page featured an article about urban isolation and mental health. The accompanying photograph showed my apartment again, but this time it reflected all the changes I'd made over the past week. My rearranged furniture, my new plant arrangements, even the pile of laundry I'd left on my chair the night before. Someone or something was continuing to document my private space, updating their surveillance in real time. I moved out the next day, abandoning my lease and most of my belongings. I found a new place across town, a different building where no one knew me. I changed my name, my job, my entire routine. But sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly isolated, I still check newspaper stands around the city. I flip through publications I've never heard of, scan their photo sections carefully, because I've learned that privacy is an illusion, that the spaces we think are ours alone might be more public than we ever imagined. And sometimes late at night, in my new apartment, I wonder if tomorrow's newspaper is already being printed somewhere with fresh photos of my current sanctuary spread across its front page. The cameras are always watching, even when we can't see them, especially when we can't see them. My name is Rebecca Torres, and I work as a freelance graphic designer in Austin, Texas. I live in a converted garage apartment behind an old Victorian house in East Austin, the kind of place where the rent is just barely affordable and the Wi-Fi cuts out whenever it rains. It's not glamorous, but it's mine, and after my messy divorce 6 months ago, having my own space felt like a small miracle. I've always been meticulous about my work, maybe obsessively so. My handwriting is distinctive. I learned calligraphy in college and never quite shook the habit of making even grocery lists look like formal invitations. It's become part of my professional identity, the personal touch that sets my design work apart from the digital crowd. That's why I recognized it immediately when I saw it in the Austin American-Statesman classifieds on Thursday morning, October 12th. I'd been drinking coffee and half-heartedly scanning the paper, a morning ritual I'd picked up since the divorce, something to make the quiet apartment feel less empty. I was flipping through the classified section, not really reading, when my own handwriting jumped off the page. The ad was in the personal section, written in my unmistakable script. seeking someone who remembers what I've forgotten. Rebecca. T29 needs to know what happened during the 3 days in September. If you were there, if you saw what I did, please call. I can pay for answers. 5112-555-0847. The phone number was mine. The age was correct. But I had no memory of placing this ad. No recollection of losing 3 days in September. No idea what I might have done that I couldn't remember. I stared at the page until my eyes watered, trying to understand how my handwriting could appear in a printed newspaper. The classifieds were typeset, not handwritten. But there it was, my distinctive lettering reproduced perfectly in black ink, as if I'd written it directly onto the page with a pen. My hands shaking, I called, the newspaper's classified department. Hi, I'm calling about an ad that ran today in the personal section. The one from Rebecca T? Let me look that up, the woman said. I heard typing. I'm not seeing any ad under that name in today's personals. What's the content of the ad? Read it to her verbatim. No, sir, we don't have anything like that. Are you sure you're looking at today's paper? I checked the date on the front page. October 12th, 2024. Today's paper. Could you check if anyone named Rebecca Torres has placed ads recently? More typing. No record of that name in our system. Is there anything else I can help you with? I hung up and immediately called my own number from my landline. It rang through to my cell phone, which was sitting right next to me on the coffee table. The number in the ad was definitely mine, but according to the newspaper, the ad didn't exist. I took photos of the page with my phone and drove to a nearby coffee shop to buy another copy of the paper. In the new copy, the personal ad section looked completely different. No ad from Rebecca T, no mention of forgotten days in September, just the usual collection of lonely hearts and missed connections. But in my original copy, the ad was still there, written in my own hand. That afternoon, my phone started ringing. The first caller was an elderly man with a gravelly voice. You're looking for answers about September, right? I saw you at the Greyhound station downtown on September 18th. You were crying, talking to yourself. You kept saying you had to get away before you hurt someone. I'd never been to the Greyhound station. I don't even take public transportation. That wasn't me, I said. Lady, I know what I saw. You had that same voice, same dark hair. You were wearing a green jacket and carrying a black suitcase. You bought a ticket to El Paso but never got on the bus. Just sat there for hours staring at the departure board. I hung up, but the phone rang again almost immediately. This time it was a young woman. Rebecca, is this about what happened at the hospital? Because I was working the ER that night and, honey, you were in rough shape. We tried to keep you for observation, but you checked yourself out against medical advice. What hospital? What night? September 19th, Seton Medical Center. You came in around 2 a.m., disoriented and bleeding from your hands. Said you couldn't remember how you'd gotten there. Dr. Martinez wanted to run some tests, but you refused and left around dawn. I looked down at my hands. There were faint scars on my palms that I'd attributed to a gardening accident weeks ago. But now, seeing them in a new context, they looked more deliberate, like defensive wounds. The calls continued throughout the day. A bartender at a dive bar on East 6th Street who remembered serving me shot after shot on September 20th, even though I rarely drink and never go to bars alone. A clerk at a pawn shop who said I'd tried to sell my grandmother's wedding ring, a ring I was still wearing on my right hand. A taxi driver who'd picked me up from somewhere in the hill country and driven me back to Austin in complete silence. Each caller described a version of me that I didn't recognize, doing things I'd never do, going places I'd never been. But they all knew details about my appearance, my voice, my mannerisms that only someone who'd actually met me could know. By evening, I was terrified to answer the phone, but I couldn't stop myself. Each call felt like a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. The last caller was different. A woman with a soft, familiar voice that made my skin crawl even though I couldn't place it. Rebecca, you don't remember me, do you? Should I? We spent those 3 days together. September 18th through 20th. You called me when you found the first note. What note? The one you wrote to yourself. The warning. You said you'd been sleepwalking for weeks, doing things you couldn't remember. You were scared you were losing your mind, so you started leaving yourself messages. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What kind of messages? Instructions, reminders, places to go, people to see. You were trying to figure out what was happening during the hours you couldn't account for. Where are you calling from? I'm in El Paso now. That's where we went together after you realized the sleepwalking was getting worse. You thought distance might help, might break whatever cycle you were stuck in. I've never been to El Paso. Rebecca, you need to check your apartment. Really check it. Look for the notes you left yourself. Look for the things you hid when you were awake in the dark. The line went dead. I searched my apartment systematically, looking in places I'd never think to hide anything. Behind picture frames, inside book covers, taped under furniture. In a shoebox at the back of my closet, I found them. Dozens of notes, in my own handwriting, documenting weeks of lost time. You woke up in the kitchen at 3 a.m. with dirt under your fingernails. Check the news for missing persons reports from September 15th. The man at the pawn shop recognized you. You've been there before. You're not sleepwalking. Someone else is using your body. The final note was different, written in the same handwriting but with a completely different voice. Rebecca doesn't know about me yet, but she's getting close. I've been borrowing her body for months now, living the life she's too afraid to live. But I need more time. The classified ad will buy me that time. Will make her think she's going crazy instead of looking for the real answer. Below that, in what looked like my normal handwriting. If you're reading this, I figured out how to stay conscious during the switch. The classified ad was my idea, a way to find witnesses to prove I'm not insane. But be careful. She's getting stronger, and she doesn't want to give me back. I'm writing this now because the sun is setting and I can feel myself getting drowsy. I've hidden cameras around my apartment, set up recording equipment, done everything I can to document what happens when I sleep. If you see another classified ad from Rebecca T., don't call the number. Call the police instead. Because I'm starting to remember those 3 days in September. And what I'm remembering isn't something I did. It's something someone else did while wearing my face. My name is Jake Morrison, and I work as a paramedic in Denver, Colorado. It's a job that's trained me to expect the unexpected, to stay calm when chaos erupts around me. But nothing in my 8 years of emergency response prepared me for the morning I received a breaking news alert about a crime I was supposedly going to commit that evening. I was finishing my overnight shift at Denver General, grabbing coffee in the break room around 6 a.m. on November 8th, when my phone buzzed with a news notification from the Denver Post app. I almost ignored it. Breaking news at dawn usually meant another traffic accident or political scandal I didn't have energy for after 12 hours of medical emergencies. But the headline made my blood freeze. Paramedic arrested in downtown. Denver armed robbery. 1 injured. That was strange enough, but what made my hands start shaking was the subheading. Jake Morrison, 31, charged in botched convenience store robbery on 16th Street Mall. My name, my profession, my age. But I was standing in a hospital break room, exhausted from a night of saving lives, not robbing convenience stores. I tapped the notification to read the full article, my heart pounding as I scrolled through details. That made no sense. According to the Denver Post, I had entered a 7-Eleven on the 16th Street Mall at approximately 9:30 p.m. on November 8th, today, armed with a knife. The article stated that I'd demanded money from the register, but when the clerk hesitated, I'd panicked and stabbed him in the shoulder before fleeing on foot. The victim, a 19-year-old college student named Marcus Chen, was listed in stable condition at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital. I was apparently caught on security cameras and identified by my paramedic ID badge, which I'd inexplicably worn during the robbery attempt. But it was only 6 a.m. on November 8th. The crime I was reading about was supposed to happen in 15.5 hours. I checked the timestamp on the article, November 9th, 2024, 2:17 a.m. The article was dated tomorrow, reporting on events that hadn't happened yet. My mind raced through logical explanations. Maybe it was a mistake, a different Jake Morrison. Maybe the app had glitched and shown me an old article with wrong dates. Maybe I was more exhausted than I realized and hallucinating. But when I refreshed the app, the article was gone. No breaking news alerts, no search results for Jake Morrison or 16th Street robbery. It was as if the notification had never existed, except I'd read every word. I drove home to my apartment in Capitol Hill in a daze, replaying the details from the article. The 7-Eleven on 16th Street Mall was a place I passed regularly but had never entered. I didn't even carry a knife, my paramedic kit had medical shears but nothing resembling a weapon. The entire scenario seemed impossible, but the specificity of the details haunted me. Why would I rob a convenience store? I made decent money as a paramedic, had no significant debts, no gambling problems or drug habits. I'd never committed so much as a parking violation. The idea of me threatening someone with a knife was absurd to anyone who knew me, but the article had described my supposed motive. Recent gambling losses had put me in debt to dangerous people, and I needed cash fast to avoid worse consequences. This was completely false. I'd never gambled beyond the occasional lottery ticket. Yet something about reading those words felt oddly familiar, like déjà vu from a dream I couldn't quite remember. I tried to nap when I got home, but sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the article's description of Marcus Chen, the college student I was apparently going to stab in 12 hours. 19 years old, working nights to pay for school, from a family that had immigrated from Taiwan 5 years ago. Details that felt too personal and specific to be random. Around noon, I found myself walking downtown, drawn by a morbid curiosity to see the 7-Eleven where my alleged crime would take place. The store was ordinary, fluorescent-lit aisles of snacks and energy drinks, a middle-aged woman behind the counter reading a paperback novel. Not Marcus Chen. Maybe that was good. Maybe the shift change would prevent whatever the article had described. But as I stood outside the store, something strange happened. I could picture exactly how the robbery would unfold. The layout of the security cameras, the position of the register, the knife I would somehow be carrying. It wasn't a plan I was making. It was more like watching a movie of events that had already been filmed. I left downtown and spent the afternoon at a coffee shop, trying to distract myself with work emails and Netflix on my phone. But as evening approached, I felt an increasing sense of inevitability, like I was being pulled toward the 16th Street Mall by invisible strings. At 8 p.m., I was still in the coffee shop, determined to stay there past 9:30. If I wasn't downtown, I couldn't commit the robbery. Simple, logical. But at 8:45, I received a text from an unknown number. Your payment is overdue. You know what happens if we don't receive $2,000 by midnight? I stared at the message, my hands trembling. I'd never received anything like it before, had no idea what payment it referred to or who had sent it. But somehow, reading those words triggered a flood of memories that didn't belong to me. Memories of placing bets on football games through a sketchy website. Losses piling up week after week. A meeting with two men in expensive suits who explained my options with quiet, menacing voices. A deadline I'd forgotten until now, but these weren't my memories. I'd never gambled, never met with loan sharks, never accumulated debt to dangerous people. Yet the memories felt as real as anything I'd actually experienced. At 9:15 p.m., I found myself walking toward the 16th Street Mall, a kitchen knife from my apartment somehow in my jacket pocket. I had no conscious memory of taking it, no recollection of leaving the coffee shop or deciding to go downtown. But there I was, approaching the 7-Eleven exactly as the article had described. Inside the store, a young Asian man was behind the counter, reading a textbook while occasionally glancing up at customers. Marcus Chen, though his name tag just said Marcus. He looked exactly as I'd somehow expected, tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the slightly hunched posture of someone balancing school and work. I approached the counter, my hand finding the knife handle in my pocket. The movements felt automatic, like I was following a script I'd memorized but never agreed to perform. "Excuse me," I heard myself say, my voice sounding strange and distant. "I need you to open the register." Marcus looked confused. "Sir, you need to buy something first." That's when I realized I still had a choice. The future described in the article wasn't inevitable. It was just one possible path. I could walk away, refuse to play the role that had somehow been written. For me, I pulled my hand out of my pocket, empty. "You're right. Sorry, I'm just really tired from work." I grabbed a pack of gum from the counter display and paid with my credit card, making sure to smile and make eye contact. "Have a good night, Marcus." I left the store and walked home, the knife still unused in my pocket. Whatever force had tried to manipulate me into fulfilling that dark prophecy had failed. The next morning, I checked every news source I could find. No robbery at the 16th Street 7-Eleven, no injured college student named Marcus Chen, no arrest warrant for Jake Morrison. But I kept the knife and I kept the memories that weren't mine, because I learned that the future isn't fixed, even when someone tries to write it in advance. Sometimes the most important breaking news is the story that never gets written, the crime that never happens, the choice to walk away when destiny tries to drag you down a darker path.